The following is a presentation of the Mat Talk Podcast Network.
This episode and every episode of the Short Time Wrestling Podcast was brought to you by the generous and awesome support of listeners like you. Do your part and go to mattalkonline.com/join the team and make your monthly pledge. You'll get some cool rewards and perks like access to my Mat Talk Online statistical almanac, digital preview guides, and even some cool swag like shirts, hats, and pint glasses. mattalkonline.com/join the team. And welcome to episode 507 of the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. Jason Bryant here with you. This episode is something different. It's, if you're familiar with the Short Time Wrestling Podcast, you know that I sometimes change things up. I do things a little different. It's not just a standard interview. A couple episodes ago, I gave you a behind-the-scenes look at what I do when I'm broadcasting an event, in this case solo, at the Asian Championships. But Laura Conway, an official who's worked with USA Wrestling for a number of years, had an idea about doing an officials podcast from the United States Wrestling Officials Association. These are the freestyle officials. You see them in Fargo. You see them at all our events nationally. You see some of them that work through the UWW chain and up through the Olympics. So what Laura did is at the U.S. Open, sat down with a couple of officials and did a roundtable on things that they were working on throughout the course of the event, certain rule changes. So she gives us a look into, I guess, the mind of the official to kind of open up some transparency and say, hey, what really is it like to be out there? What do the referees look for? So this is a special episode, 3 parts that Laura sent out. And if you want to give feedback on whether or not you want to see more of this type of content, whether it be originated from the Mat Talk Podcast Network, or if Laura is thinking about doing a show on her own for officials, or if it's something that you wanted to hear periodically, maybe some updates, email Laura at conway.usaw@gmail.com and give her your feedback. Also, send it to me, jason@bryantwrestling.com. I'm curious on what you have to say about a different dynamic of behind the scenes, something that, people complain about officials all the time, but what are the officials talking about? So this is an insight on how at least it works here in the United States. So as always, I'd like to thank you for spending your time with me, because you've always got time for Short Time. Cue the swoosh.
All right, go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
My name is Zach Garrett, and I'm the one of the clinicians here at the U.S. Open.
Awesome. All right, so for our audience members, coaches, athletes out there, can you give us a rundown of Greco, the difference between negative wrestling and passivity, which order we look for calling it first, and maybe timing?
So when we look at negative wrestling, first we're looking at really 2 questions. The first question is whatever they're doing, does it prevent the athlete from being able to take a hold? And if it prevents them from taking a hold, then we're going to define that typically as negative wrestling. So for example, grabbing hands, their heads down, they got 2 hands blocking the chest, it's preventing the other wrestler from being able to take hold. And when it prevents that, that's going to be negative wrestling. If they're able to get a hold and then not make an action, that leads to our second question is what they're doing, does it prevent them from starting an attack? So they have a hold, but they can't start an attack. That's typically going to be defined as passivity and be looked at and called accordingly. So that's kind of the differences between passivity and negative wrestling. And in terms of a match, a lot of times early in the match, we typically see wrestlers that come out as they feel each other out, they're grabbing their hands, they're blocking with 2 hands on the chest. And as a result, we often see negative wrestling early, and it's something we want to control early in matches as well. Because if we can get them to open up, they typically do a great job of scoring points, as long as they're not preventing people from being able to take holds and get in position. So negative wrestling is typically going to be called a little earlier in matches, but certainly can be called throughout the course of a match as any time that it becomes present. But it's something we look for a lot more earlier. Then as the match progresses, then we start looking a little bit more at passivity as it goes.
And Gary Mayab has used the phrase, you want to bookend negative wrestling. Can you explain that phrase, bookending negative wrestling?
So again, negative wrestling, calling it early in the match typically helps score more points. Because now they're down, there's points already on the board, so now they're looking to score to get back and take a lead. at the end of matches, a lot of times you have wrestlers who have a lead who then are blocking and running and fleeing the hold potentially. So, and fleeing the hold is also considered negative wrestling. So I think when we're referring to bookends, a lot of times it's called at the very beginning and sometimes called at the very end of the match. Throughout the course of that, you don't always see it as much, and that's typically where passivity starts to come into play a little bit during the middle part.
Awesome. All right. And what about passivity? When are we supposed to be calling it, and what does it look like now as opposed to other years?
So they changed the rule to where you're allowed to make 2 passivity calls in the same period that would result in parterre. That was a change from last year where you could only have 1 parterre position per period. So, but that doesn't really change much in how we call it. We're still in the first period. If it's 0-0 and we haven't scored, there's not points, we're looking to only make 1 passivity call in that first period, which would then potentially lead or result into parterre, or the chance to have parterre position. And that's probably going to come somewhere after the first minute of the match. It's not something we want to call really quickly because then you have a long time to go the rest of the period. So sometime between a minute, better minute 30 is typically when you see those first passivity calls go up on the board. Then in the second period, again, if we're assuming that no points are being scored and it's not negative wrestling, then we're obviously going to be looking to call passivity at that point. And probably in the first 45 seconds into that second period, you're potentially going to see the second passivity call, which could result in parterre as well. And again, that could be either wrestler. So you could call red in the first period, and you could come back, and if red's still passive, you can call red again. So it's not a requirement that you give each person a chance on top and parterre, but there's only 2 parterre positions during the course of a match. So after those 2, there's only basically one passivity that will be called after that, and that would just be a passivity call with 1 point and not stopping the match. And typically if that's going to get made, and that's only in extreme cases where we would make that third passivity call if needed, but that would probably come somewhere before 1 minute left in the match, ideally. That way the score may be 2-1, but the wrestler who's losing knows that they're losing. They have over a minute to score. So that's ideally what we look at with timing-wise, but certainly every match has got its own story, and you have to be able to navigate through based on when our points are scored and how the points are scored, and there's a lot of things to look at.
All right, and one last question as it pertains to cadets. They're down to 2 minutes now. So what does passivity look like? Might it look like if it's a really good match, no one's really being negative, no one's being passive? What happens now with that 2 minute period?
So in Greco-Roman, it's still after a minute you're going to make that passivity call, and then probably in the second period you're only probably going to get 1 passivity call. So you're going to have 1 each period if they're not scoring points. Mm-hmm. But what's great about that age group is they typically do go score points, so it's not something you have to worry about too much. So it doesn't really change a lot Greco-wise. It's actually maybe a little easier in Greco timing-wise. In freestyle, it's a little bit more challenging because if it's 0-0 at the end of 1 minute into the first period, you have to stop and put somebody on the activity time. And I've seen some great wrestlers and great cadet matches where they are wrestling for that solid minute and they are close to scoring but never score points. And then somewhere at the end of that minute, you have to put somebody on activity time. Not because we want to, but that's just because of what the rule is. So you put them on activity time and then you start the clock at that point. So it just means that it's going to come a little quicker. There may or may not be a warning, maybe get a warning in, but there's no guarantee in freestyle that you'll get a warning. It might just go right to the 3 minutes and they'll put somebody on the activity time. So a little more challenging from a referee perspective because it's a lot easier to time out your calls with 3 minute periods. But again, you don't see as much of a problem because that age group does a great job of scoring points.
All right, so anything else you want to let our audience know, coaches, parents, athletes, before we started with the session?
I don't think so. I think the only part that I would add is, certainly refereeing is a very difficult job. And I also coach. I coach high school and we have freestyle and Greco-Roman club, so we're coaching all 3 of the styles. And what I know is as you're going through as a coach and you look at how the referee, it's a difficult job and they have to make really split decisions. And when you're out on the mat controlling everything else along with the mat besides just scoring the points, it's very difficult. So certainly please keep an open mind as you go through and do it. If you ever have an opportunity to go just get a chance to go referee, it helps put some things in perspective, especially when you're coaching and you're looking at the next. Like I think for sure it has definitely helped me as a coach because I referee, so I better what to look for, better how to coach the techniques because I know how they score points. So it's certainly an avenue that I would encourage people to go give a try at least once just to see what that perspective looks like.
All right, cool. Thank you. We'll see you next session. All right, here we are on day 2 at the U.S. Open, and can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, I'm Casey Gessel. I'm the assigned senior Greco head referee at this event.
All right, and today we have some questions for our athletes, our coaches, our audience, our parents. We want to talk about the block throwing system. Can you give us just a basic rundown of what blocks are for, and maybe what consequences are if, they quote-unquote lose or win a brick toss?
Well, it challenges the athlete's opportunity to review a specific call or non-call made in a match to potentially benefit them. So in general, the coach would throw the challenge block onto the mat in a very non-discreet manner.
You mean you can't throw it right at the ref?
Correct. We're not using it as a weapon. We just make it clear that they want to challenge a call and get the referee's attention and Matt Chairman's attention to stop the match at a point where the athletes are in a sort of neutral scenario.
And would it be better for coach to throw it like off to the side or throw it right in the middle of the athletes and where they are?
Well, a light toss towards the center of the mat is fine. We just want to make sure they're not throwing it at the referee or for the athletes either, for that matter. The athlete always has the prerogative to deny a challenge if they so choose. In the past, the referee would ask to confirm the challenge with the athlete. Starting a couple years ago, the rule changed to the point where if the block is thrown, the referee grabs the block, proceeds to the chairman's table, unless the athlete stops the referee from doing that and says, no, I don't want to challenge. All right. At that point, the head referee for that event will look at the video and determine the outcome. That outcome at that point is final. If the challenge goes in favor of the wrestler requesting the challenge, they get their brick back and can challenge as many times as they want throughout a match, as long as they continue to win that challenge. So by favor, what I mean is either the challenging athlete gains points or the challenging athlete's opponent loses points.
Right, because then if we were looking at earlier a 2 blue situation where Blue's coach thought it should have been a 4 blue,
correct, but
it went 1 red. And that would be losing favor.
Right.
Correct?
So in that scenario that you mentioned, the red athlete got 1 point for the scoring action and 1 point extra because Blue lost their challenge.
Okay.
So a swing of 4 points in that specific scenario. So yeah, I mean, obviously, from our eyes, bad challenge, but you got to be careful what you ask for sometimes. You can challenge anything in the mat that occurs during a match, with the exception of 2 things: passivity calls and fall calls. You can challenge the action that led to the fall.
For example, a leg foul.
Foul in Greco-Roman, or an illegal action in freestyle. However, you can't challenge the actual pin itself.
Okay.
You can challenge time as well. That's most commonly done at the end of a match or end of a period. However, you can challenge it during the course of any match or any period within a match. So that's what you're looking at in those scenarios. Well, you're allowed as many challenges as you want during a match as long as you keep winning. Otherwise, once you lose that challenge, you've lost your ability to challenge the rest of the match.
All right, what about some of the what we call emotional throws of the block?
Yeah.
What are they? Because we saw it a lot at U15s. So can you throw a block to check score versus what happens if you throw a block and you take it back right away?
All right, so if a coach takes advantage of throwing the block just to throw the block, especially out of frustration, more often than not, that challenge will be denied and the coach will be given a yellow card.
Okay.
That's more commonly done internationally. We just don't tolerate that. Generally, if a coach or an athlete has a challenge available to them and they want to challenge, we look at the challenge, whether it's going to affect the match or not. With that in mind, could you anticipate some changes down the road for that? It's very possible. In my opinion, this is strictly my opinion, it's not good for the fan experience if we're looking at a challenge of a score that honestly, whether they win the challenge or not, will not affect the final outcome, as something that may change, but I'm just speculating.
Okay. And one last quick question. If we're not in a block throwing situation, what is an appropriate way for a coach to approach the table to ask a question? What's the best advice you could give coaches or even parents, like at locals, to approach and ask?
I think the biggest thing is if there's confusion, especially in your grassroots age categories, we're probably going to at least talk to the coach. The coach just has to approach the table during a stoppage in the match and ask for clarification on the score. And if they're not content with the score, at that point they can request a challenge. But at the senior age level, if there's some confusion about the score, especially what went on the board, we may address that quickly. But more often than not, if they have a challenge available to them and they are not content with what the score was or is, then they need to challenge that and go through that process. That's their protest, is the challenge. And that challenge needs to be done in an appropriate time manner as well. Consistently, we say a reasonable amount of time. That's probably about 5 seconds. That's not set in stone. Oftentimes we'll review the last scoring action, but if it's a rapid sequence of scoring moves, we may review that entire sequence as well. Our goal obviously is to get the score correct, and to make sure that the athletes are getting the benefit of the doubt.
Any advice before we close it out? Coaches, athlete, like if they're watching, mom at home, like if they're watching anything like that?
The thing we sometimes tell coaches is just be careful what you ask for. I've seen some scenarios where coaches think an action is a 5-point scoring action, and then it comes back that it's the other wrestler's score. I also tell coaches that you have to be cognizant of the angle of which the camera is placed. Some events we only have one camera. Some events we have multiple cameras. The more cameras, the better the view, obviously from different scenarios. But if you only have one camera and the action is away from that camera, just be advised it might not be able to see that very well on review. And at that point, honestly, our only option is to go, from an NFL sort of comparison, the call stands, sort of deal.
And coach would get their block back at that point in time too?
No. Well, in those scenarios, the coach doesn't get their block back. The only time we return the block is if the camera does not pick up the scoring action.
Okay.
Sometimes you'll see a really quick action that goes directly toward the camera, and the camera person doesn't have enough time to view back or zoom back. Oftentimes they just don't pan across the mat quickly enough, and they completely miss it. In our view, it's just not fair. We go with the call that was made on the mat. They get their challenge brick back.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for your help, Casey.
My pleasure. Thanks.
All right. So in this last session, there was a lot of out-of-bounds calls and confusion, and maybe coaches and parents not understanding why things were called the way they were. Can you go over some general out-of-bounds education for all of us?
So out-of-bounds is, there's a few situations that are really difficult as a referee, and I think because it's not always the most clear situations, and out of bounds is one of those areas that's difficult to call just because there's so many different variables that come into play. For example, when you're in the standing position and you step out, it has to be the entire foot. Your opponent would be awarded 1 point. Now that's when the defensive wrestler's in a standing position, so it's certainly possible that the attacking wrestler could be on a knee and could be attacking, taking a shot, and that wrestler steps out of bounds. So both wrestlers do not have to be in the standing position. We typically look at it from a defensive wrestler's position, where they're at and when they go out of bounds. You also can receive a point if make an action going out of bounds and it was standing and it lands in parterre out of bounds. That would still score 1 point. Some of the situations that get a little more challenging are when there's actions in it going out of bounds and they're close to finishing the scores. And if it's close, when in doubt, typically the higher point value will prevail. So if it's close, whether it's 1 point for an out of bounds or 2 points for a takedown, depending on the situation, it could very well be scored 2 points just because they can't really finish too far out of bounds. So if it's close, sometimes they'll score 2 points versus 1 point.
And is that going with the theory of we want to reward risk and like someone making actions like that?
It is a little bit. I think that the hard part is, if this was in the center of the mat, we'd probably let it go a little bit longer to allow them time to finish the action. But because it's going out of bounds, we have to blow the whistle. And if it's close and they're under attack and they have a leg and they're sitting on a hip or their butt, we're probably going to potentially score that 2 points. But again, every situation's a little bit different, so it's really difficult to make this situation black and white because there are so many different scenarios and different parts that come with this. I think the other part too, when we're taking a look at this, is when they step out, it's permissible to step out of bounds and then still score. So if I'm red and I'm attacking and I step out but I finish my action, I'll still score at a higher point value. And I saw that a couple of times this past session where a wrestler would was attacking across the mat, and the wrestler wizarded a little bit, and red's head hit out of bounds, but then finished on top of blue. So we scored it to red. Blue challenged because they thought they wanted the 1 point for the out of bounds with the head, but because red was able to finish the action, we still scored that as 2 points red. So certainly those scenarios come into play a little bit. And the other part too, from a referee's perspective, we often look at how if the red wrestler is attacking blue and blue steps out, we typically are a little slower on the whistle to allow them an opportunity to score higher points. So it's possible that they step out of bounds where they're able to pull them back in and finish, or they can finish the action going out of bounds. So as a referee, they might point at the action, and then they're going to wait and see if they can get a higher point value before stopping it. If the action can't continue, then they'll stop and score 1 point. But if they could score higher points, 2 points or 4 points, they're going to score the higher point value. So, and you have also situations like we're fleeing the mat, where wrestlers will leave the mat under attack. And we mentioned this in our past meeting here, that anytime a wrestler faces the out of bounds while under attack, like it's a guaranteed fleeing the mat for a caution, and 1 point freestyle or a caution, 2 points in Greco-Roman. So it's actually a pretty easy call. But anytime we have fleeing the mat and we have close to takedowns, we have to make a decision. Is it fleeing the mat, or is it a takedown, or is it just 1 point? And typically when it's close, like, we always go with what's better for the attacking wrestler. So in freestyle, if it's close and it's a take, maybe they fleed the mat but they got a takedown, we're going to score the takedown, not fleeing the mat, because 2 points is better than a caution and 1. Whereas in Greco-Roman, fleeing the mat is a caution and 2 points. So if that's the case, it would be better to give the fleeing the mat call with a caution 2 than just giving the takedown. So we typically try to reward the attacking wrestler with the higher amount of points as possible. So there's so many scenarios that come into play with out of bounds. It's certainly an area that we focus on almost every clinic to try to work on and improve, but it's definitely one of those areas that gets challenged, one of the biggest areas for challenges.
So here's 2 quick situations that I've actually worked with and people have asked me about it. If I'm red and I have a single leg under my armpit, right, and I'm trying to finish it, and if blue starts facing out of bounds to get out of my single leg, how should we be awarding that as referees? Like, they face out of bounds, they go out of bounds, and the argument is, well, where else are they supposed to go? Their leg is up in a single leg.
Sure. So first, if I have a leg up in the air and they just take you out of bounds, it's just 1 point. There's no fleeing the mat. There's no part. It's just 1 point, and go back and restart and wrestle. If your leg up in the air and then the defensive wrestler turns and faces the out of bounds to kick out, they can do that in the center of the mat, no problem. But if they do that on the edge and they leave the mat during that process, that's going to be considered fleeing the mat, because you're facing out of bounds and you're kicking and you're going out of bounds. If it's in the center, no problem. But if it's on the edge and you're doing it and going out of bounds, it's going to be called fleeing the mat.
Okay. And then one more situation. There's the differentiation between, if ground wrestling has been established, it gets pushed out of bounds and they stand up, versus landing out of bounds. And you hit the landing out of bounds part, but could you differentiate that for parents and coaches and athletes?
So I would say one of the biggest areas, like particularly freestyle, is you take a shot, they're somewhere in the center, they end up in a wizard position, and they stay on the mat. Both wrestlers are on a knee, they're like working, trying to gain position, and they go out of bounds on each other. Each of them are on a knee and they go out of bounds that way. In this case, anytime the wrestling leaves in parterre, it's just restarted back in the center with no points. The point's only given if the action goes out standing or it was standing and lands in parterre, out of bounds. But if they establish parterre inbounds and then go out, it's going to be no points and then restart back in the center.
Okay, awesome. Any other advice or thoughts going into this next session?
No, certainly this is going to be a very intense session. We've got the men's freestyle semifinals, and there's a number of great wrestlers about ready to go compete. So there's going to certainly be some scrambles and some great actions. And if we make it through with no challenge, I'll be surprised. So I'm expecting a pretty exciting semifinal. And then once that finishes up, we're going right into the Greco women finals, which are both, big matches for the wrestlers, because for some of those weight classes there they haven't established the number one, who is a past world medalist. The winner of this allows them to have go right to the direct finals at the challenge tournament or for the world team selection process. So certainly a lot on the line this coming session. So going to be one of the better sessions to watch. So
awesome, cool. Well, thank you for your time.
The Short Time Wrestling Podcast is proudly outfitted by Compound Clothing. Shirts, singlets, custom gear orders, everything you need. Call up Cliff and the crew at cmpteamwear.com. Hey, you know what? Did you like the show? You want to hit that subscribe button? MatTalkOnline.com/listen. Various different ways to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcatcher of choice. And if you're already subscribed, you already listened, you love the show, and you want to support this show and this network, MatTalkOnline.com/join the team. Become a team member today.